Victoria Chen had always believed that success was a fortress. Build it high enough, strong enough, and nothing could touch you. She'd spent 15 years constructing her empire brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Tech Vista Solutions wasn't just a company. It was her identity, her proof to the world that the girl from a struggling immigrant family could become someone who mattered. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire city. Victoria used to stand there every morning with her coffee, watching the sun rise over the buildings, feeling like she'd conquered something important. That morning, though, the view made her stomach turn. The envelope sat in front of her on the long glass table, white, official, sealed with the company logo she'd designed herself. Her hands shook as she picked it up. She already knew what it said. The emergency board meeting the night before had made everything clear. Her business partner, the man she'd trusted for over a decade, had been working behind her back for months. She opened it anyway. Sometimes you need to see the words to believe they're real. Effective immediately. Relieved of duties as Chief Executive Officer. Best interests of the company. Transition of leadership. The words blurred together. Victoria sat down in her usual chair at the head of the table, except it wasn't her chair anymore. Nothing in this room was hers anymore. 15 years of 80-hour weeks, missed holidays, sacrificed relationships, all reduced to 2 pages of corporate language that essentially said, "You're done." Her phone buzzed, then again, and again. The news was already spreading. Reporters, colleagues, investors, everyone wanted a comment, an explanation, a piece of the drama. Victoria turned the phone off and sat in the silence of the empty boardroom. How had she missed it? The signs must have been there. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. The sudden budget discussions she wasn't included in. Her partner's increasing absences, blamed on family matters. She'd been so focused on taking care of her mother, who'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's 6 months ago, that she'd taken her eye off the very thing she'd built. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her entire adult life prioritizing work over everything else. Now, the one time she'd chosen family first, her work had been stolen from under her. The next few weeks moved like a nightmare in slow motion. Lawyers explained things using words like fiduciary duty and shareholder interests. Her partner had convinced the board that Victoria was making erratic decisions, that her mother's illness was affecting her judgment, that the company needed fresh leadership. He'd even found emails she'd sent at 3 a.m, framing her dedication as instability. The legal battle drained her savings faster than she'd thought possible. Corporate law wasn't cheap, and her partner had the company's resources behind him. Her personal accounts were frozen while investigators looked into accusations of financial misconduct, claims she knew were false but had to be disproven with expensive audits. Her penthouse apartment, the one she'd bought as a symbol of her success, was seized as collateral. The bank was surprisingly efficient about it. One day she had a home, the next day she had an eviction notice and 72 hours to remove her belongings. That's when Victoria discovered who her real friends were. Turned out, she didn't have any. The people she'd had dinner with, vacationed with, celebrated successes with, they all vanished like smoke. Phone calls went to voicemail. Text messages were left on read. Lunch invitations were met with sudden scheduling conflicts. One former friend actually crossed the street to avoid her. Victoria watched it happen, standing on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases containing everything she still owned, and the woman she'd known for 8 years literally turned around and walked the other direction. The media didn't help. The business sections ran stories with headlines like, "Tech CEO's dramatic downfall" and "From corner office to courthouse." They used her worst photos, the ones where she looked tired or angry. Anonymous sources, probably people she'd worked with, described her as difficult and obsessed with control. Nobody mentioned the charity work, the mentorship programs, the employees whose careers she'd championed. Victoria's lawyer suggested she stay with family while things got sorted out. But her mother was in a memory care facility, and Victoria was an only child. Her father had passed away years ago. There were some distant cousins she hadn't spoken to in a decade. The thought of calling them now, asking for help when she'd been too busy to attend their weddings and graduations, made her feel sick. That's how Victoria Chen, former CEO, Stanford MBA, woman who'd been featured in Forbes magazine, ended up at St. Mary's Women's Shelter on a rainy Tuesday evening. The shelter was in a converted school building on the east side of the city, the part of town Victoria had driven through but never really seen. Mrs. Patterson, the director, was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She didn't recognize Victoria from the news, or if she did, she didn't mention it. "First time in a shelter?" Mrs. Patterson asked, filling out intake forms. Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. "You'll be in a shared room. 4 beds, bathrooms down the hall. Dinner's at 6, breakfast at 7. You can stay for up to 90 days while you get back on your feet. We've got job counseling, legal aid referrals, and support groups. You're safe here." Safe. The word felt strange. Victoria had never thought about safety before. She'd thought about success, about growth, about market share and quarterly earnings. Safety seemed like something other people needed. The room was small, with 4 narrow beds, 4 small lockers, and 1 window that looked out onto a parking lot. 3 of the beds were occupied. A young woman who looked barely 20 was feeding a baby. An older woman sat on her bed, folding and refolding the same shirt. The 3rd bed was empty, but someone's belongings were there. Victoria chose the remaining bed, the one closest to the window. She put her suitcase in the locker and sat down. The mattress was thin and she could feel the springs through it. This bed probably cost less than the throw pillows on her old couch. That night, Victoria lay awake listening to sounds she'd never heard before. The baby crying softly, the older woman praying in Spanish, footsteps in the hallway, sirens in the distance, rain against the window, and beneath it all, the sound of women breathing, women sleeping, women surviving. She thought about her morning routine from just months ago. The expensive coffee maker, the marble bathroom, the walk-in closet full of designer suits, the car service that picked her up at 7:30, the assistant who had her schedule memorized, the corner office with that view. All of it felt like it had happened to someone else. Victoria pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. There was a water stain in the corner, shaped like a hand reaching for something. She wondered what she was supposed to reach for now. She'd spent her entire adult life climbing toward something, and now she'd fallen so far she couldn't even see the bottom. For the first time in her life, Victoria Chen didn't have a plan. She didn't have a goal. She didn't have a next move. She had a bed in a shelter, a suitcase of clothes, and a dead laptop that had gotten wet in the rain on her walk there. She had nothing. And that terrified her more than anything ever had. 3 weeks into shelter life, Victoria had established a routine. Wake at 6, shower while hot water was still available, breakfast in the common area. Then she'd walk to the public library, 3 blocks away, where she could use the computers for free. Every day she sent out resumes. Every day she got either silence or polite rejections. "We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Your qualifications are impressive, but we're looking for someone with a different background." One HR manager was honest enough to tell her the truth. Nobody wanted to hire someone involved in a public legal battle, even if they weren't guilty of anything. The shelter had a community center attached to it, connected by a covered walkway. Victoria had noticed it but never gone inside. She kept to herself mostly, avoiding the support groups and activities Mrs. Patterson kept suggesting. Victoria didn't need support. She needed a job, a place to live, and her life back. But the library closed early on Wednesdays for staff training, so Victoria found herself with nowhere to go. The shelter was depressing during the day when it was mostly empty. She wandered toward the community center, figuring she could at least sit somewhere quiet. Inside, the center was busy in a chaotic kind of way. Kids were everywhere, playing games, doing homework, running around. Volunteers supervised activities at different tables. A bulletin board advertised free classes, ESL, computer skills, job interview prep, parenting workshops. Victoria found an empty corner near some computers and sat down. She pulled out a notebook where she'd been tracking her job applications and started reviewing her approach. Maybe she needed to change her resume format. Maybe she should target smaller companies. Maybe she should consider a different industry entirely. "Excuse me, are you using this computer?" Victoria looked up to see a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark curly hair pulled into a ponytail. She was holding a math workbook and looking at Victoria hopefully. "No, go ahead," Victoria said, moving her things. The girl climbed onto the chair and opened her workbook, then stared at the screen, then back at the workbook. She sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that seemed too big for such a small person. Victoria tried to focus on her notes, but she kept noticing the girl out of the corner of her eye. The kid would write something, erase it, write it again, erase it harder. Finally, she put her head down on the desk. "You okay?" Victoria asked, surprising herself. The girl looked up. "I hate fractions," Victoria almost smiled. "Fractions are tricky. My dad says I just need to practice more, but I don't get it. How can 1/2 plus 1/3 equal 5/6? That doesn't make sense." Without thinking, Victoria pulled her chair closer. "Can I show you something?" The girl nodded eagerly. Victoria grabbed a piece of paper from her notebook. "Okay, imagine you have a pizza, right? And you cut it in half. How many pieces do you have?" 2. "Right, now imagine a different pizza cut into 3 pieces. You take 1 piece. That's 1/3. Victoria drew simple circles and divided them. "But what if we want to add them together? We need to cut both pizzas the same way so we can count the pieces fairly." She kept drawing, explaining, making it visual. The girl's face slowly changed from confused to curious to understanding. By the time they finished 3 problems, the kid was grinning. "I get it now. It's like finding a common language for the pizzas." "Exactly," Victoria said. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than anxiety or despair. She felt useful. "Sophie, time to go!" A man walked over, tall with broad shoulders and work boots covered in dust. He had the kind of tired face that came from physical labor and not enough sleep. When he saw his daughter with Victoria, he smiled apologetically. "Sorry, I hope she wasn't bothering you." "Sophie, I told you not to bug people." "She wasn't bugging me," Victoria said quickly. "She was just working on math homework. And she helped me, Dad. I finally understand fractions." The man looked at Victoria with something like surprise, then gratitude. "Well, thank you. I'm Daniel Morrison, and this troublemaker is Sophie. Victoria Chen." She shook his hand. It was rough, calloused, the hand of someone who worked with tools and materials, not keyboards and conference calls. "You're good at explaining things," Daniel said. "Sophie's teacher is great, but sometimes she needs to hear it differently, you know?" "I remember struggling with fractions too," Victoria lied. Math had always been easy for her. But something about this man's grateful smile made her want to seem more approachable, less like the person she used to be. Daniel seemed like he wanted to say something else, but Sophie was tugging on his arm. "We'll let you get back to your work." "Thanks again." They left, and Victoria sat there feeling strange. That small interaction, 10 minutes of explaining pizza fractions to a 3rd grader, had made her feel more human than weeks of networking events used to. She came back to the community center the next day. And the day after that, Sophie was there most afternoons, and Victoria found herself looking forward to helping her with homework. The kid was smart and funny, and she asked questions that made Victoria think differently. "Why do you write everything in that notebook?" Sophie asked one day. "I'm looking for a job," Victoria explained. "What kind of job?" "I'm not sure anymore. I used to run a company, but that didn't work out." Sophie considered this seriously. "My dad says when something doesn't work out, maybe it's because something better is coming. He said that when my mom died." The casual mention of death delivered with such matter-of-fact sadness caught Victoria off guard. "I'm sorry about your mom. Thanks. I miss her. But Dad says we have to keep going, right? So we come here after school and he teaches people how to get jobs and I do homework and we're okay." Victoria learned that Daniel was a volunteer who ran job skills workshops twice a week. He taught basic things: how to write a resume, how to dress for interviews, how to answer common questions. Victoria observed one of his sessions from the back of the room and found herself simultaneously impressed and frustrated. Impressed because Daniel was patient and encouraging, never making anyone feel stupid for not knowing something. Frustrated because his advice was basic, stopping short of the kind of strategic thinking that could really help someone stand out. After the session, she approached him. "Can I make a suggestion?" Daniel looked surprised. "Sure. The resume format you're teaching is outdated, and you're telling people to list their duties, but they should be listing their achievements, show impact, not just tasks. She expected him to be defensive. Men in positions of authority usually were when a woman offered advice. But Daniel just pulled out a notebook and said, "Can you explain that more?" So she did. They talked for 30 minutes standing in the community center as it emptied out, Sophie playing nearby. Victoria explained achievement-based bullets, quantifying impact, tailoring applications to job descriptions. Daniel listened intently, asked good questions, and actually incorporated her feedback. "You really know this stuff," he said finally. "Have you ever thought about teaching it?" Victoria laughed, but it came out bitter. "I'm not qualified to teach anything right now. I can't even get hired myself. That doesn't mean you don't know how to do it. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who are still figuring things out. They remember what it's like to struggle." The word stayed with Victoria that night as she lay in her shelter bed. She'd always thought of herself as someone who had to have all the answers, be the expert, never show weakness. But maybe there was value in being in the middle of the mess, still trying to find the way through. The next week, Daniel asked if she'd co-teach his workshop. Victoria's first instinct was to say no. She didn't want people at the shelter to know about her business background. Didn't want them looking her up online and seeing the news articles. Didn't want their judgment or pity. But Sophie heard Daniel ask and said, "Please, Victoria. You're so good at explaining things." So Victoria said yes. That first workshop was terrifying. 15 people sat in folding chairs looking at her expectantly. Some were young, some old. Some had been out of work for months, others for years. All of them were trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to keep them down. Victoria started talking, and something unexpected happened. She stopped thinking about her own failure and started focusing on theirs. Not in a pitying way, but in a problem-solving way. This person needed to highlight transferable skills. That person needed to address an employment gap without sounding defensive. Someone else needed to completely restructure their resume to show progression. She moved around the room, looking at each person's situation individually, offering specific advice. When she sat down with a woman who'd been a stay-at-home mom for 10 years and was terrified of re-entering the workforce, Victoria felt something click into place. "You've been managing a household," Victoria told her. "That means budgeting, scheduling, problem-solving, conflict resolution, and project management. Those are executive-level skills. We just need to frame them correctly." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "You really think someone will hire me? I think you're more qualified than you realize. You just need to see yourself differently." After the workshop, Daniel pulled Victoria aside. "That was amazing. You connected with them in a way I never could." "You connect fine," Victoria said. "You just do it differently." "Maybe," Daniel said. "But I think we make a good team." Team? Victoria hadn't been part of a team in a long time. She'd been a boss, a leader, someone who made decisions and expected them to be followed. But a team meant partnership, meant equal footing, meant trusting someone else. It felt risky. It also felt like maybe, just maybe, it might be exactly what she needed. 2 months into living at the shelter, Victoria had stopped counting days until she could leave. Something strange was happening. She was building a life here, small and simple but more real than anything she'd had before. The workshops with Daniel became the highlight of her week. They'd meet before each session to plan, usually at a coffee shop near the community center. Daniel would buy coffee, insisting it was a business expense for his volunteer work, and Victoria would pretend she didn't notice it was also because she couldn't afford her own. "I've been thinking," Daniel said one morning, stirring sugar into his cup. "What if we expanded beyond just resume help? A lot of people who come through here need to learn how to negotiate salary, handle workplace conflicts, understand their rights." Victoria nodded slowly. "Career development, not just job hunting." "Exactly. But I don't know enough about that corporate side of things. I've been working construction since I was 18. Never had to negotiate anything except which site I'd work on next week." "I could teach that," Victoria said, then hesitated. "But I don't know if people want to learn from someone who lost everything." Daniel looked at her seriously. "Victoria, you didn't lose everything. You lost a company. That's not the same thing. Feels the same. Only because you thought the company was who you were. But I've watched you these past weeks. The way you explain things to Sophie, the way you help people in the workshop see their own value, that's who you are. The company was just where you did it before." His words hit something deep in Victoria's chest. She'd spent so many years equating her worth with her title, her salary, her success. Without those things, she'd felt like nothing. But here she was, sitting in a cheap coffee shop, wearing jeans from a donation bin and somehow making a difference in people's lives. The expanded workshop started the following week. Victoria taught a session on workplace communication that drew 20 people, more than they'd ever had. She shared stories from her corporate life, but now they sounded different. Not like humble brags about her success, but like lessons learned through mistakes and failures. I once lost a major client because I was too proud to admit I didn't understand what they actually needed, she told the group. I assumed I knew better. Cost the company $2 million. So when you're in a job interview and they ask if you have experience with something you don't, be honest. Say you're willing to learn. That's worth more than fake expertise. People responded to her honesty. They asked questions, shared their own experiences, stayed after to talk. One man who'd been out of work for 18 months after his factory closed came up to Victoria with tears in his eyes. I thought I was worthless, he said. But you helped me see that my 30 years of manufacturing experience translates to so many other fields. I've got an interview next week at a warehouse management company because of what you taught me. Victoria went back to the shelter that night feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Pride. Not the hollow pride of closing a big deal or getting featured in a magazine, but the solid, real pride of helping another human being see their own worth. Sophie had become a fixture in Victoria's daily life. The kid had somehow decided Victoria was her person, and she wasn't shy about it. She'd wait for Victoria after school, homework already out, ready to tackle whatever subject was giving her trouble. My teacher says I'm getting really good at math now, Sophie announced one day. She asked me what changed, and I told her my friend Victoria helps me. Friend. The word made Victoria's throat tight. She couldn't remember the last time someone had called her friend and meant it the way Sophie did. Uncomplicated, honest without any agenda. Daniel noticed the bond forming between Victoria and his daughter. One Saturday, he invited Victoria to join them at the park. It felt strange, almost wrong, like she was intruding on their family time. But Sophie begged, and Daniel seemed genuinely pleased by the idea, so Victoria agreed. The park was busy with weekend crowds, families having picnics, kids on playgrounds, couples walking dogs. Victoria and Daniel sat on a bench watching Sophie play, and for a while they just enjoyed the normalcy of it. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. Why did you really end up at the shelter? I've heard bits and pieces, but I don't understand how someone goes from running a company to having nowhere to live. Victoria considered giving him the sanitized version, but something about Daniel made lying feel wrong. So she told him everything. The betrayal, the legal battle, the frozen accounts, the friends who disappeared, the way everything she'd built had collapsed like a house of cards. The worst part wasn't losing the money or the company, she said. It was realizing how completely alone I was. I'd sacrificed every real relationship for my career, and when the career was gone, there was nothing left. Nobody. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know something about that. When my wife got sick, I thought I had a lot of friends too. But cancer is uncomfortable. People don't know what to say, so they just stop saying anything. By the end, it was just me, Sophie, and the nurses. You find out real quick who actually cares about you versus who just liked being around your happiness. How did you keep going? Victoria asked. Sophie, he said simply. I had to. She needed me. Still needs me. Some days that's the only thing that gets me out of bed. They watched Sophie swing higher and higher, her laughter carrying across the playground. Victoria felt a strange ache in her chest. She'd never wanted kids, had always been too focused on her career to even consider it. But watching Sophie with Daniel, seeing the way they took care of each other, she wondered if she'd missed something important. You're really good with her, Daniel said. With Sophie. She talks about you constantly. Victoria taught me this. Victoria said that. She hasn't connected with anyone like this since her mom died. Victoria didn't know what to say to that. The responsibility of mattering to a child felt enormous and terrifying. As weeks turned into months, Victoria's life fell into a rhythm she never expected to enjoy. Mornings at the library job hunting, though with less desperation now. Afternoons at the community center, either helping Sophie or preparing workshops. Evenings back at the shelter where she'd started joining the support groups Mrs. Patterson ran. The support groups surprised her. Victoria had assumed they'd be depressing, full of people complaining about their problems. Instead, they were full of people surviving their problems. Women who'd escaped abuse, women who'd lost homes to medical debt, women who'd aged out of foster care with no support system, all of them fighting to build better lives with whatever tools they had. One woman, Rita, had become something like a friend. She was in her 50s, had lost her husband and her home in the same year, and had a way of cutting through nonsense that Victoria appreciated. "You still acting like you don't belong here?" Rita asked one night as they folded donated clothes together, another shelter chore Victoria had started helping with. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. You keep waiting for your real life to start again. This is your real life, Victoria. Might as well start living it." The words stung because they were true. Victoria had been treating the shelter like a waiting room, a temporary stop before she got back to normal. But what if this was normal now? What if she built something new instead of trying to reconstruct what she'd lost? That night, lying in her shelter bed, Victoria made a decision. She pulled out her notebook and started writing. Not another job application, but a plan. A real plan for a different kind of future. The next day, she pitched it to Daniel over coffee. "I want to start a nonprofit," she said. "Something that helps professionals who've experienced career catastrophes. People who had successful careers and then lost everything. Who don't fit the typical profile for social services, but still need help. People like me." Daniel listened as she explained her vision. Programs that addressed not just the practical needs like job hunting, but the psychological impact of sudden downward mobility. The shame, the isolation, the loss of identity. "It's a good idea," Daniel said. "But nonprofits need funding, space, staff. How would you even start?" "I have no idea," Victoria admitted. "But I'm good at figuring things out. And I finally have something worth building." Daniel smiled, the kind of smile that made his tired face look younger. "You know what? I believe you, and I think I want to help." "Why would you do that?" "Because I've spent 3 years teaching people how to write resumes, and in a few months you've shown me there's so much more we could be doing. You see possibilities I don't. And also," he paused, "because Sophie would be devastated if you left and never came back." "Just Sophie?" Victoria asked before she could stop herself. Daniel's eyes met hers and something unspoken passed between them. "No," he said quietly. "Not just Sophie." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them seemed ready to name. Victoria's heart was racing. She hadn't thought about romance in years, had convinced herself she wasn't built for it. But Daniel was looking at her like she mattered in a way that had nothing to do with her achievements or failures. "Dad!" "Victoria!" Sophie came running over from where she'd been coloring at a nearby table. Breaking the moment, she had a drawing she'd made, all 3 of them holding hands under a rainbow. "This is my family," she announced proudly, then seemed to realize what she'd said. "I mean, this is us. You're like family, right, Victoria?" Victoria looked at the drawing, at Sophie's hopeful face, at Daniel's soft expression. Something inside her, something that had been frozen and locked away for years, began to crack open. "Yeah," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "We're like family." 6 months into her shelter stay, Victoria received a call from her lawyer. She was in the middle of a workshop when her phone buzzed, and she normally would have ignored it. But the name on the screen made her step outside. "Victoria, I have news," Robert Chen, her lawyer and distant cousin, said. "The investigation cleared you completely. Your former business partner is facing multiple fraud charges. The prosecutors want to know if you'll testify." Victoria leaned against the brick wall of the community center, processing. "What about my assets? The accounts that were frozen? We can start recovery proceedings. It won't be everything you lost, but it's substantial. You could potentially have access to funds within a few months." She should have felt relieved, victorious even. Instead, she felt conflicted. The life she'd built here at the shelter and community center, small as it was, had become real. The thought of leaving it made her chest tight. "I need to think about it," she told Robert. "Think about what?" "This is what we've been fighting for." "I know. Just give me a few days." She walked back inside but couldn't focus on the rest of the workshop. Daniel noticed and pulled her aside afterward. "Everything okay?" Victoria told him about the call. She expected him to be happy for her, to congratulate her on getting her life back. Instead, his face fell for just a moment before he recovered. "That's great news," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Victoria, you can't seriously be thinking about staying at a shelter when you don't have to. I'm not thinking about staying at the shelter. I'm thinking about staying here in this community, continuing what we've started. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. What have we started exactly? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them had voiced. Before Victoria could answer, Sophie came running over, upset about something at school. The conversation ended there, but the question lingered. That night, Victoria lay awake thinking about futures. The old future, where she'd have money and freedom to start her nonprofit properly to help people on a larger scale, and the current present where she helped people one at a time, where Sophie did homework at her elbow, where Daniel made her coffee and they planned workshops together. 2 weeks later, everything changed again, but not the way Victoria expected. Sophie got sick. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away. Then came the fever. Daniel took her to the clinic, then the emergency room when the fever spiked. They admitted her immediately, pneumonia but severe. Sophie's immune system was compromised, the doctor said, likely stress-related. They used words like monitoring and observation and we'll know more in a few days. Victoria found out when she showed up at the community center for their Wednesday workshop and Daniel wasn't there. One of the other volunteers told her Daniel had called, said his daughter was in the hospital, asked them to cancel everything. Victoria grabbed her jacket and ran the 1.5 miles to the hospital. She'd never run anywhere in years, hadn't needed to, and her lungs burned by the time she reached the pediatric ward. She found Daniel in a waiting room, his head in his hands. Daniel. He looked up and the devastation in his eyes nearly knocked her over. Victoria, you didn't have to come, and of course I came. She sat beside him. What did the doctor say? He explained everything in a flat, emotionless voice that scared her more than crying would have. Sophie was stable but struggling. The antibiotics weren't working as quickly as they'd hoped. She'd be in the hospital for at least a week, maybe more. I can't lose her, Daniel said suddenly, his voice cracking. I can't do this again. When my wife was sick, I had to watch her fade away bit by bit. And I promised myself I'd keep Sophie safe, but I can't control this. I can't fix it. Victoria pulled him into a hug. This man who'd been nothing but strong and steady, and let him fall apart. He sobbed into her shoulder, all the fear and exhaustion and grief pouring out. She held him and said nothing because sometimes there were no words. When he finally pulled back embarrassed, Victoria said, I'm not leaving. Whatever you need, I'm here. Over the next few days, Victoria proved that promise. She organized everything Daniel couldn't think about while sitting at Sophie's bedside. She called his work site and explained the situation. She contacted Sophie's school. She set up a meal schedule with people from the community center who wanted to help. She also discovered that Daniel's insurance had a high deductible and hospital stays were expensive. He tried to hide the bills from her, but Victoria saw them when she brought him a change of clothes. The numbers made her sick. He'd already depleted his savings when his wife was sick. This would bury him financially. Don't, he said when he caught her looking. Don't worry about the money. I'll figure it out. Daniel, you can't afford this, then I'll work more hours. Take a second job, whatever it takes. And who takes care of Sophie while you're working yourself to death? This is ridiculous. Let me help. With what? You're living in a shelter, Victoria. I'm not taking money from you. The words stung, even though he hadn't meant them cruelly. It was just fact. She had nothing to give, except she did, actually. She had skills, connections, and a determination that had built a multi-million-dollar company. Money wasn't the only resource that mattered. Victoria spent that night making phone calls and sending emails. She contacted people from her old life, swallowing her pride to ask for help. Some ignored her, but some responded. People she'd worked with years ago. Before the betrayal, who remembered her differently than the news stories portrayed. She set up a crowdfunding campaign, carefully worded to protect Daniel's privacy while explaining Sophie's situation. She reached out to local businesses asking for donations. She contacted medical billing advocates she'd found online and learned how to negotiate with hospitals. Within a week, she'd raised enough to cover Daniel's deductible, and then some. The community center volunteers contributed. People from the shelter donated what little they had. Even Mrs. Patterson gave money from her own pocket. When Victoria showed Daniel the account balance, he stared at the screen in disbelief. How did you do this? I asked for help, Victoria said simply. Turns out people are good when you give them a chance to be. Daniel looked at her with something in his eyes that made her heart race. "Why are you doing all this?" Victoria thought about lying, giving some noble reason about community and paying it forward. Instead, she told the truth. "Because you matter to me, both of you, more than I knew anyone could matter anymore." Before Daniel could respond, a nurse came to tell them Sophie was awake and asking for her dad. They went together, and Sophie's face lit up when she saw them both. "I knew you'd come," Sophie said to Victoria, her voice raspy from coughing. "Dad said you were busy, but I knew you'd come." Victoria took Sophie's small hand. "Of course I came. We're family, remember?" Sophie smiled weakly. "Yeah, family." That night, after Sophie fell back asleep, Daniel and Victoria sat in the hospital cafeteria drinking terrible coffee. They'd been there for hours, would probably be there for hours more. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, "about what you said about us mattering to you." Victoria's heart hammered. "Daniel, you don't have to—" "I'm scared," he admitted. "I lost my wife and it almost destroyed me. The only thing that kept me going was Sophie. I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone else that close. Wouldn't risk that kind of pain again. I understand. But then you showed up with your expensive coffee taste and your fancy degree, pretending you weren't falling apart. And Sophie loved you immediately like she knew something I was too stubborn to see. And I watched you transform from this closed-off broken person into someone who lights up when she's helping others. And I realized I'd already let you in without meaning to." Victoria didn't trust herself to speak. "What I'm trying to say is, when you got that call from your lawyer, my first thought wasn't good for her. It was don't go. And that scared me. Because I have no right to ask you to stay in this small life when you could have your big life back. What if I don't want the big life?" Victoria said. "What if I'm happier in the small one?" "Are you?" She thought about her penthouse apartment she'd never felt at home in. Her corner office where she'd worked alone into the night. The business dinners where every conversation was strategy. The success that had felt hollow even while she was achieving it. Then she thought about teaching Sophie fractions, about watching people's faces light up in workshops when they realized their worth, about laughing with Rita while folding donated clothes, about coffee with Daniel, planning ways to help people neither of them had met yet. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm, and Victoria realized this was the first time in her adult life she'd held hands with someone and felt completely present in the moment. "Sophie's going to be okay," he said. "The doctors told me while you were making phone calls. The new antibiotics are working. She'll be home in a few days." Relief flooded through Victoria so intensely she felt dizzy. "Thank God." "Yeah." Daniel squeezed her hand. "And thank you. For everything. For being here, for caring. For becoming part of our lives when we didn't even know we needed someone. I think maybe I needed you more," Victoria admitted. They sat there in the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital cafeteria, holding hands across a table sticky with spilled coffee. And Victoria thought about all the fancy restaurants she'd eaten in, all the important meetings she'd attended. None of them had felt as significant as this moment. Sophie came home from the hospital on a Thursday morning, weak but smiling. Daniel had rearranged his entire apartment to make it easier for her recovery, moving her bed to the living room so he could keep an eye on her, setting up a little station with books and art supplies within easy reach. Victoria visited that afternoon, bringing soup from the community center kitchen and a card that everyone at the shelter had signed. Sophie's face lit up when she saw it. "Everyone signed it?" she asked, looking at all the names. "Everyone," Victoria confirmed. "You've got a whole community rooting for you." That evening, after Sophie fell asleep, Daniel walked Victoria back to the shelter. It was the first time they'd been truly alone since the hospital, without crisis or exhaustion clouding everything. "Can we talk about something?" Daniel asked as they reached the shelter entrance. Victoria's stomach flipped. "Sure. Your lawyer called you weeks ago about recovering your assets. You never told me what you decided." "I've been focused on Sophie." "Victoria, you can't put your whole life on hold because my daughter got sick. That's not fair to you. I'm not putting my life on hold. I'm living it." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. "What does that mean?" Victoria took a breath. This was the moment she'd been avoiding, the decision she'd been dancing around. "I told Robert to proceed with the asset recovery. I'm not walking away from what's mine. But I'm also not going back to who I was. I don't understand. I'm going to use the settlement money to start the nonprofit we talked about. Second Summit Foundation, remember? A place for people who've experienced career catastrophes to rebuild. But I'm not running it from some fancy office downtown. I want to run it from the community center. Keep it connected to the real people who need it. Daniel studied her face. You've really thought this through. I have. And I know it's not what you expected, me sticking around. If that's uncomfortable for you, I can understand. I can find another community center to work with, give you space. Stop, Daniel said. Victoria, I don't want space. I want the opposite of space. I've been terrified to tell you that because I thought you'd leave as soon as you could. And I didn't want to make you feel obligated to stay for me. Victoria's heart was pounding. I'm not staying for you. I'm staying for me. But you being here is definitely part of why staying makes me happy. Just part? Daniel asked, and there was something playful in his voice that she'd never heard before. A significant part, she admitted. He stepped closer. Can I kiss you? I've wanted to for weeks, but the timing was never right, and I didn't know if you felt the same way, and Victoria kissed him, cutting off his nervous rambling. It was sweet and tentative and perfect. Nothing like the practiced kisses of her past relationships that had always felt performative somehow. This felt real. When they pulled apart, Daniel was grinning like a teenager. So we're doing this? Whatever this is? I think we are, Victoria said. If you want to, I want to. Sophie's going to be thrilled. She's been asking me when you're going to become her actual family, not just pretend family. The word family still scared Victoria a little, but it was a good kind of scared. The kind that meant something important was happening. Over the next few months, Victoria's life transformed in ways she never could have planned. The settlement came through, not the full amount she'd lost, but enough to matter. She paid back everyone who'd contributed to Sophie's hospital fund, though most tried to refuse. She registered Second Summit Foundation as an official nonprofit, with Daniel as a board member and Rita from the shelter as their first employee. They kept the workshops going, expanded them actually, adding new programs based on what people needed. Career counseling, financial literacy, mental health support for professionals dealing with the shame of downward mobility. Victoria had lived through it, so she knew how to talk about it without making people feel broken. The foundation got attention, the good kind. A local news station did a story about Victoria's journey from CEO to shelter resident to nonprofit founder. The piece was honest, showing both her failures and her recovery. It inspired other professionals going through hard times to reach out for help. Sophie recovered fully, though the experience changed her. She was more serious sometimes, more aware of how fragile life could be, but she was also more appreciative of small things, more openly loving with her dad and Victoria. One Saturday afternoon, about 8 months after they'd met, Victoria was helping Sophie with a school project at Daniel's apartment when the little girl asked a question that changed everything. Victoria, are you going to marry my dad? Victoria choked on her water. Daniel, who'd been fixing dinner in the kitchen, dropped a pot with a loud clang. Sophie, he called out. You can't just ask people that. Why not? You said we should be honest about our feelings. And I honestly want to know if Victoria's going to be my mom. Victoria looked at Sophie's hopeful face, then at Daniel standing in the kitchen doorway looking panicked and hopeful in equal measure. That's a conversation your dad and I would need to have first, Victoria said carefully. But would you want to? If he asked? It was too big a question for a 9-year-old to ask. But it was also the most important question Victoria had been asked in years. Yes, she said. I would want to. Sophie pumped her fist in victory. Dad, did you hear that? She said yes. She didn't say yes to anything, Daniel protested, but he was smiling. She said she would want to, which is different. So ask her, Sophie demanded. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. That's not how proposals work, sweetheart. There's supposed to be planning and romance and what? Sophie interrupted. We're already a family. We have dinner together and Victoria helps me with homework. And you two hold hands when you think I'm not looking. What else do you need? From the mouths of children, Victoria thought. Sophie was right. They'd been building a family for months without calling it that. Making it official seemed almost redundant, except it wasn't. It mattered. She's got a point, Victoria said to Daniel. He walked over and sat down on the couch beside her. Victoria Chen, I'm going to do this properly later with a ring and better words. But my daughter's right about one thing. We're already a family in all the ways that count. So I'm going to ask you now. In my messy apartment with mac and cheese burning on the stove, will you marry me? It wasn't the proposal 9-year-old Victoria would have imagined for herself. That girl had dreamed of expensive restaurants and elaborate gestures. But the woman she'd become, the one who'd lost everything and found something better, knew this moment was perfect. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes, Sophie screamed with joy and launched herself at both of them, creating a group hug that knocked them all backward on the couch. They were laughing and crying, and Sophie was already planning the wedding, talking about dresses and flowers and whether they could get a dog. Can we get married at the community center? Victoria asked. I want everyone who helped us get here to be there. Daniel kissed her forehead. We can get married anywhere you want. They got married 3 months later in the community center gymnasium, decorated by volunteers and shelter residents who'd become friends. Mrs. Patterson officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Sophie stood between them during the ceremony, holding a small bouquet and beaming with pride. Victoria's vows made half the room cry. I came to this community broken and alone, convinced I'd lost everything that mattered. Daniel, you showed me that I hadn't lost everything because I'd never really had it. I had success and money and recognition, but I didn't have connection, community, or love. You gave me all of that just by stepping forward when I needed someone most. You and Sophie taught me that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build with people who choose you every day. Daniel's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. Victoria, when we met, I'd convinced myself that I was done living, that I was just going through motions for Sophie's sake. You reminded me what it feels like to be fully alive. You made my daughter laugh again. You made me believe in possibilities again. You are the bravest person I know, and I'm honored that you're choosing this small, messy, beautiful life with us. The reception was potluck, with everyone bringing their best dishes. There was no fancy wedding cake, just dozens of homemade desserts arranged on a table. There was no DJ, just a volunteer with a speaker playing a mix of songs. There was no expensive venue or designer dress, but there was joy. So much joy that it filled every corner of that gymnasium. Rita pulled Victoria aside at one point. You remember what I told you? About this being your real life? I remember. You've built something good here. Not what you had before, but something better. I hope you know that. Victoria looked across the room at Daniel dancing with Sophie, at Mrs. Patterson laughing with volunteers, at shelter residents she'd taught in workshops now celebrating with her. I know, she said. I really do. Later that night in their new apartment, nothing fancy but theirs, Victoria stood at the window looking out at the city lights. Daniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Any regrets? He asked. Victoria thought about her old penthouse view, the one she used to look at every morning feeling like she'd conquered something. She'd been so proud of that view, never realizing how lonely she was enjoying it alone. None, she said, and meant it completely. Sophie called out from her room, asking for water before bed. Daniel groaned playfully. And so begins married life with a 9-year-old. Victoria laughed and went to get Sophie's water, feeling more at home in this small apartment with its hand-me-down furniture than she ever had in her penthouse. The next morning, Victoria woke early, a habit from her corporate days that she'd never quite shaken. But instead of reviewing reports or checking stock prices, she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table working on plans for Second Summit Foundation. They were launching a new program next month for mid-career professionals dealing with sudden job loss. Daniel shuffled out in his pajamas, hair sticking up, and kissed her good morning. Working already? Can't help it. I've got too many ideas. That's my wife, he said. And they both smiled at the word. Wife. It felt foreign and perfect at the same time. Sophie emerged demanding pancakes, and they spent the morning being a normal family doing normal things, making breakfast, arguing about whether chocolate chips counted as a breakfast food, planning their day. It was spectacularly ordinary. Later, Victoria went to the community center for a workshop. As she set up chairs and reviewed her notes, she thought about that day 8 months ago when she'd sat at a computer, her laptop dying, and whispered, "Please, don't leave me here alone." She hadn't known then that being left there was the best thing that could have happened, that rock bottom would become her foundation, that losing everything would teach her what actually mattered. Daniel had stepped forward that day, and in doing so, he'd given her a chance to step forward too. Not back into her old life, but forward into a new one. One built on connection instead of achievement, on community instead of competition, on love instead of success. Victoria looked around the community center, at the people starting to arrive for the workshop, at the bulletin board covered with success stories from people they'd helped, at Sophie doing homework in the corner while waiting for her dad to finish his shift. This was her life now. Smaller than before, slower than before, but infinitely richer. And as the workshop began and Victoria stood up to help another group of struggling professionals find their way forward, she realized something important. She'd spent 15 years climbing to the top, only to discover the view was lonely. But here, at ground level, surrounded by people who'd chosen to stand beside her, the view was beautiful.